Hello Art 2 students. So the purpose of this video is just to show you some of the lifting technique on the sky that I had already begun. Now at this point I am ready to do some of that lifting technique to bring back some of the clouds and put a little more depth into my sky. So I've got some fresh water, I've got my paint, I've got my brushes, I've got paper towels. And the first thing that I could do would be to go directly in with water and lighten up certain areas. I could also put a wet layer of paint over my sky. So I'm going to do a little bit of both just so that you guys can see. So I'm going to start by putting a wet layer of sort of a bluish color over this section. Because even though the lifting is primarily for when you have paint that is already dry, it can also still be very helpful on wet layers of paint to lighten and add texture and depth. So right now I'm just going to put a blue layer of paint over top of this section. I'm still going to use water to let it kind of fade into the rest of the sky. But you can see that because the blue is transparent, it's not covering over completely or anything. I can still see the color that is underneath there. And then while that is still wet, I could go directly in with my paper towel and just sponge up certain areas of it. And it's going to lift mostly just that layer that I just added. It's not going to lift much other than that layer. So that's one way that you can do the lifting technique. It doesn't make a huge difference, but in reality, the lifting technique is a pretty subtle thing anyway. So now I'm just going to put some just water in some of these areas just to lighten them with the lifting technique that way. And I could go ahead and just sponge that up, and it will lighten the first layer of paint that I had there. You can also do this as a bit of a combination of things. You can put more pigment down, and you can put more water down, and you can lift. You can do all sorts of combinations. Just because you're trying to make a certain area a certain color or a certain value does not mean that you cannot mix and match the different techniques. So I'm just going to continue working on the sky a little bit, looking at my reference image, putting a little more depth in. There's definitely some more sort of a deep purpley red over here. So I'm going to use wet on wet to put some blue and some red into this section to make that sort of deeper purpley bluish red there. Now keep in mind I will be lifting some of this, so it's not all going to remain as dark as what it currently is when I put that layer down. It can be a little stressful. But then I'm going to go in with my paper towel and just kind of sponge some of that up. You can also use a tissue, because the tissue will be softer. It will leave a little bit less of a texture. You can also use your paintbrush. So you probably have seen me do that a little bit, where I'll just use my paintbrush and dry it off. Apparently I'll just take the whole thing right off. But I'll dry the paintbrush off and then go back into that section, and I'll continually dab my brush. And that's really good for like if you have a small area or you're just trying to soften the edge of something. Like here I'm just softening that edge. Here I'm lifting a smaller area. I'm going to add a little more water to this area to soften it out deeper and wider. And then I'm going to soften that edge. Because with clouds, you'll notice that there are some sort of harder edges in there, but there are other areas where it is just very soft, kind of just fades into white or into the next color. So you want to have a little bit of both if you are doing a realistic sky. Again, looking at that reference image, because for me, all the darker areas are on the bottom part, and they're sort of more on this side. So that's kind of what I'm looking at and mimicking in my reference example. I've just got it pulled up on my computer in front of me, same as you guys will with your Chromebooks. And again, while it is important to look closely at what you are doing in terms of your reference image, it's more important that I can see that you understand how to use the techniques. So yes, we do sort of have a goal in terms of a reference image, but even more important is your understanding of the techniques and of using the watercolor paint. So here I'm just softening this edge to almost create like a hole in that cloud there where you see a bit of that brighter blue. And I'll go over here and I'll add a little more of my brighter blue. And again, add more water to kind of soften it into the next set of colors. So then that might be my second layer on the sky, and shows using the lifting technique in a couple of different ways. And then the next thing that I would do would be to work into these mountains, and then I would work my way down the rest of the page. I would probably do the trees at the very, very end, because they are sort of in front of the mountains and in front of the sky and things like that. So I do the mountains, I do the water, some of the snowbanks, and then I go back in and do the trees at the very end. And like I said previously, I will do a couple of demonstrations of different types of trees so that you can see some of how some of those trees are done. And then at the end, once this is dry, once the sky is dry, if I want to go back in with the lifting technique even again and brighten up some of the whiter areas in the clouds, I absolutely could. Just remember that if you have any cloud area where you want it to be white, you will want to leave the paper white. So on my particular example, there really is no white. There's a couple colors that are very close to white, but because there were none that were just straight up white, I did not leave necessarily any of my page showing. I do want to soften this edge a little bit, so I'm just going to go in with my paintbrush. Because one of the really nice things about watercolor paint is that you can continue to work into the page and into the paint while things dry, because at different levels of dryness, different effects happen. Some effects happen better, some happen less. Some effects only happen at certain points, different things like that. So I'm going to let this dry. I probably will lift a little bit more on the sky before it's finished, but I do want to also make sure that I get a chance to give you guys some demonstrations of some trees and different things like that.